will now be recorded.
This is Jennifer Coffey from the Office of Special Education Programs. I'm here to talk about a new competition for the State Personnel Development Grants Program, and this is for fiscal year 2020. Couple of things to keep in mind about this webinar: that the slides I'm going to share are for guidance only. So I am summarizing information from the notice inviting applicants, from the overall application package that gives you directions for this competition. So just to keep in mind, I'm going to highlight some things, I'm going to focus on some things, but this is not comprehensive at all. So please do read all the documents. And I also wanted to let you know that if you are newer to applying for any grants in the Special Education Programs Office here at the U.S. Department of Education, please do take a look at this recorded webinar that you see the link to, and you should be able to get there by accessing these slides and going to that link. So this is the agenda for today. I'm going to talk about the purpose of the program, some technical assistance for you in developing your plan for the SPDIG that you may want to make use of. I'm going to talk about the 3 absolute priorities, go into a couple of definitions, not all of the definitions, but a couple of the definitions from the notices. I'm going to talk about the contracts and subgrants that are required for this program. I'm also going to talk about the performance measures, the Government Performance Results Act, and what that means for your application. We'll go through some general requirements and then talk about the selection criteria. So the purpose, you notice I bolded that last part. Everything that is done with for the SPDIG is in order to improve results for children with disabilities. So keeping that in mind. And so this is to assist state educational agencies in reforming and improving their systems for personnel preparation and professional development in early intervention, educational, and transition services. Again, this informational webinar does not take the place of reading through the entire application package with all the directions. It is long, and I'm here to help people. Once you watch this webinar, if you still have questions once you've read over everything, but please do really get an in-depth analysis of that. It's a peer-reviewed competition, so some tips I'm going to give you today, but we still have a group of panel members made up of people who have worked in SCAs, people who have provided technical assistance, people from our parent training and information centers or parent technical assistance centers. So keep in mind, we're going to have people with different perspectives looking for these things, and it is their perspective. They're peer reviewers. It's not OSEP who's reviewing you. And also, if you're receiving new SPDIG money in fiscal year 2020, so this coming October, if you would be receiving new funds, you cannot apply for a grant currently. We do expect to have a competition in fiscal year 2021. Doesn't mean it will definitely happen, but we do expect to have one. And so if you're receiving new money this next year, but will not the following year, so if you're a 2016 SPDIG grant, you will not be able to apply this year, but you could apply the following year. If you're a 2015 grant, you can apply now for this fiscal year 2020 competition. And the only eligible applicants are the SEAs. Just to let you know that I worked with NASD on a series of webinars to provide some assistance in thinking through the plan you could put together for your SPDIG. So it was all keeping in mind what builds a good SPDIG application. And this was over a course of about a year. We did monthly webinars. They're recorded. The resources are available at the link you see here. Logic models. So this is for all of our discretionary grants at OSEP. We have these resources to help you create a logic model that you can then create your application around. So helping you to really think about where you're trying to get to and the resources you have available to you, and then what your objectives would be along the way to get to those long-term goals. We have 3 absolute priorities in this notice. So absolute priority 3 is new for this competition. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the 3 priorities. And this is language directly from the notice. So I should say from the application package. Absolute priority 1 is from the notice of final priorities and definitions published in the Federal Register on August 2nd, 2012. So that was when that priority was first finalized, and we've used it since then. Absolute priority 2 is from sections 651 through 655 of IDEA as amended by the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. Absolute priority 3 is from the notice of final priority and definitions for this program published elsewhere in this issue of the Federal Register. So this is the priority that just came out for comment in this last year, and now it's being finalized and is part of the overall notice. Absolute priority 3 is its own funding category, and the department intends to award 1/3 of the SPDIG grants that are given. So for example, if we gave 9 awards, 3 would likely be funded who are proposing to do work under absolute priority 3. So the department intends to award 1/3 of the SPDIG grants under this competition to grants under absolute priority 3, provided applications of sufficient quality are submitted. Applications will be rank ordered separately for absolute priority 3. Therefore, applicants must clearly identify if the proposed project addresses absolute priority 3. So you're gonna have to be real clear that you are responding to it if you choose. Whether or not applicants are responding to absolute priority 3, because it is not required, it's optional, they are required to respond to absolute priority 1 and 2. So 1 and 2 are required, 3 is an option for you. The department does intend to fund 1/3 of the applications, and it'll have its own system of numbering. The applications that are of sufficient quality will be on their own list if they respond to absolute priority 3, as well as absolute priority 1 and 2, and then they'll be rank ordered from there. A little bit more about absolute priority 1. In order to meet this priority, an applicant must demonstrate the use of evidence-based professional development practices that will increase implementation of evidence-based practices and result in improved outcomes for children with disabilities. There's a lot in one little phrase here, or one sentence. So the professional development strategies that you plan to use have to have support, have to have some kind of evidence base behind them. And we've done some work to help you with that I'll talk about a little bit later in this webinar. But thinking about good adult learning strategies, thinking about the use of coaching or mentoring to support that, thinking about administrative supports, a data collection system, how you select participants, trainers, coaches. Those are all aspects of an evidence-based professional development system. And then that professional development supports the use of an effective intervention, right? Of those evidence-based practices that are being used to improve results for children with disabilities. This is also absolute priority 1. And this is about providing ongoing assistance to personnel receiving SPDIG supported professional development that supports the implementation of evidence-based practices with Fidelity. And Fidelity is a definition that I'll share with you in a moment. So this is about if you have this great professional development system that has effective training, effective ongoing coaching, good data collection system, and you're supporting a good evidence-based practice and effective intervention, you're doing all those things, then you would expect adult use of the practices to increase, to improve. And that's what this is about. So measuring implementation fidelity or intervention fidelity as a result of that effective professional development system. And this is still absolute priority 1. And then use technology to more efficiently and effectively provide ongoing professional development to personnel, including to personnel in rural areas and to other populations, such as personnel in urban or high-need local educational agencies, so LEAs. And I'm not going to share that definition, but the definition of high-need LEAs is in the notice. So ongoing professional development. So obviously we're not talking about one-time workshops or trainings. We're talking about over time. And technology can look a lot of different ways. You know, we've had people share about bug in ear or virtual coaching. You can use video of practitioners and then respond to it at a later time, so do it asynchronously. You can do modules for training that you then follow up with coaching. This can look a lot of different ways, but I think it's especially important to think about in this context. You know, what are we learning about technology use during COVID that might be useful for you? What have you learned in previous work, or what are you learning from other states during this time? Absolute Priority 2 is about the State Personnel Development Plan. And this is a very comprehensive and complex section. And so I've found ways to summarize it that hopefully work for people. But it's the idea that you're taking a look at your state's education system and your state's mental health system, your state's transition system, and the justice system, but thinking about children with disabilities, how this all affects them, and thinking about your greatest need that you could serve with your grant, and then connecting with the other work of your state where applicable, where it works. So thinking about alignment, thinking about the data collections, the implementation teams, the policies that are already in place that you could connect to meet the need that you find in your state for children with disabilities that could be served through your professional development. Absolute Priority 3, as I said, this is new. This went out for comment and has remained basically the same as a final priority. And this is about personalized professional development projects. So this is still to meet the need that you find in your state. And this is thinking about, you know, if personnel, and I'm going to provide that definition in a minute, but personnel more broadly who serve children with disabilities could benefit from having some choice in their professional development. And you'll decide what that looks like. There are some ideas here, but you're going to decide what that looks like. It needs to be consistent with the other requirements of Absolute Priority 1 and 2. And so you can see some of the requirements here of what it must do, but in the end, it's designed to meet the individual needs of those personnel. So we gave examples in the notice that if this is a novice teacher, a novice speech therapist, et cetera, and so novice personnel, they might have very specific needs, and they might be able to, say, choose from a menu of professional development options to meet those needs. If we're talking about personnel who have been in place for a while, maybe they have leadership needs that they could fulfill through professional development. So really thinking through what you're trying to accomplish and what might make sense for personnel in a personalized professional development system that helps them meet some competencies. So if you are responding to this priority, again, it's an option, but we do plan to fund 1/3 of the applications if we have 1/3 that are sufficient quality. The extent to which the proposed project will use professional development practices supported by evidence. So same idea as before. So this is, adult learning principles and training, coaching or mentoring, Fidelity assessment to see how they're doing with the use of those new practices, et cetera, et cetera. How improvement and implementation of specific supported practices over time will be demonstrated by our participants. So this is potentially going to be a little more challenging in determining how Fidelity will be assessed. And so something to think about now. What might that look like? And then how the funds that you use for these personalized professional development opportunities, how you'll ensure that sufficient funds are used for the training, for the coaching, for the Fidelity checks, for using those data to continue to improve personnel practices. And then if it is specific to teacher retention activity, so if you're working with special education teachers under this priority, you would need to collect information. If you're focused on teacher retention, we would need your data for that. And then Finally, how will you assess whether their use of the practices that they're receiving training and coaching for, how their use of the practices will improve outcomes for children with disabilities? So you need to be collecting those data as well. So here's that definition of personnel. So it's special education teachers, regular education teachers, principals, administrators, related services personnel, paraprofessionals, early intervention personnel serving infants, toddlers, preschoolers, or children with disabilities, except where a particular category of personnel, such as related services personnel, is identified. And we don't have that exception specifically. So this is personnel in IDEA, and this grant can be used to provide professional development to any of these roles of personnel. Fidelity means the delivery of instruction in the way in which it was designed to be delivered. Now, this is very much talking about adherence to the critical components of an intervention or of implementation of the professional development system. But there is more to Fidelity than just adherence. There is thinking about engagement. There's thinking about duration. So something to be thinking about, that this is kind of a very basic definition of Fidelity. Additional SPDIG requirements. So in your application, in your budget narrative, in your budget, you need to budget for a 3-day project directors meeting in Washington, D.C. during each year of the project. We have not been doing annual meetings, but that may start again. And so to have that budgeted in your application is a requirement. Budget $4,000 annually for support of the SPDIG program website, currently administered by the University of Oregon, and that's SIG Network, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then if you're going to be creating a website or using a website for this project, specific to this project, it needs to be accessible. That's the big idea there. You have to describe that it is accessible or how you plan to make it accessible. Contracts and subgrants. So there is a lot of information from Absolute Priority 2 that is very confusing related to this. It talks about required partnerships. However, those are required partnerships for this larger state plan that you would have in place. It's very confusing in IDA. So there's a larger state plan of all the things that are going on that I talked about earlier, and then there's your SPDIG plan, what you plan to do with these funds. And so the required contracts or subgrants, so you can choose either one, are to at least one LEA, at least one IHE, so university, and either a parent training and information center or a community parent resource center. Not every state has community parent resource centers. That's why it's an or. But you could choose one or the other if you have both, or you could do both. And this is all to help you carry out your SPDIG work. In addition to that, you can have as many other contracts and subgrants to public and private entities as you think makes sense for your plan. So this is the base again. This is what you're required to do. You can do things in addition to that. If you have other family engagement partners who you'd like to work with in addition to your PTI or CPRC. The use of funds for professional development, there's a required level for that. And it has to be not less than 90% of the funds the SCA receives under the grant for any fiscal year need to be used for the professional development activities described in paragraph A. Again, that's absolute priority 2. You'll find it in. Look for subsection A and the activities they describe. It's pretty broad, all the different uses of the professional development funds. It talks about the different kinds of interventions, frameworks that you might be supporting. So take a look at subsection A and let me know if you have questions once you've looked at that. And then not more than 10% of the funds. So you have to do at least 90% for professional development. Not more than 10% of the funds are for other activities described in paragraph B. And so in that subsection, I typically talk about it, so you might think about the professional development you need for say it's student-led IEPs that you're working on, or transition planning. And so you have professional development funds going toward that. And then the other activities might be, I want to make sure that teachers are being prepared to be able to support this. And so you're going to be working with the university, you're going to be working on maybe the way that they're licensing people in the state. So you're thinking about the overall system that supports that. You're doing the professional development and then thinking about the more systemic work. So that's one way to look at it. There are quite a few options though, so please do take a look at that. GEPRA performance measures. This is really important because although you're not going to be ready to collect the data as you're writing your application, you're going to have to be planning on how you would collect the data. And so this is important for thinking of your evaluation plan, but it's also important for thinking about your project design. You know, what's it going to look like? Because you're going to need to collect these data for anything that you're doing in the professional development area. And this is about using, we talked about those evidence-based professional development practices, and then those practices should then lead to improved implementation in the use of the SPDIG supported practices. So say you're doing literacy, and so you've got the training, the coaching, the data collection, administrative support, so on and so forth, that's going on in your professional development, and you would expect that the personnel you work with would improve their literacy practices as a result. So that's that fidelity measurement of the adults. And then, and also I should add, we've been talking about it being at the level that reaches the child. And so although it is critically important, if you are implementing some kind of framework like multi-tiered system support, positive behavioral interventions and support, response intervention, whatever it happens to be called, whatever it looks like, it is important to capture data about how those processes, how that overall system is being done. But this measure is going to be used going forward to capture fidelity of the intervention that reaches the child level. So be thinking about that again in my literacy example. What literacy intervention instruction is going on that would improve results for children with disabilities? Because we're going to show that through line. You're doing effective professional development. You've got a system in place that improves how the personnel use the interventions, use the practices. That in turn improves results for children with disabilities. That's how it should work, right? In that theory of action. And then this next one, projects use SPDIG professional development funds to provide activities designed to sustain the use of SPDIG supported practices. So what are you doing to continue to improve implementation and to sustain implementation? And we talk often about coaching and mentoring. We talk about data collection and using those data. Implementation teams are really important to sustain the use of SPDIG supported practices. But there are a lot of features of sustainability, and writing them into your application is going to be critical to help you sustain. And then we talked earlier about teacher retention. So if you have an objective related to teacher retention, you'll need to collect data about the personnel who receive funding, who receive services 2 years after you first started to provide those services. That's when you need to see if they're still in their positions, etc. And finally, this is about improving results or improving outcomes for children with disabilities. So how are you going to collect those data? There are resources for you, many materials at that SIG network link that you see up top. And this is important. Rubric A is about the evidence-based professional development components. So I talked about selection, training, coaching, data systems, systems interventions, administrative support. Those are all aspects of this rubric. So I recommend that you take a look at it and you think about what that means for your plan and your evaluation. And then finally, when you're thinking about the intervention you want to support, the framework you want to support, etc., these resources from the Active Implementation Hub will help you plan that out. Unless you've been supporting it in the past, this is something, the usable innovations you're going to want to think about. It includes something called the Hexagon tool that helps you think about the research behind it, whether it's a good fit for you, whether you'll be able to support implementation fully in an ongoing basis, etc. And then the fidelity assessment if you have a need to create a Fidelity assessment or further develop it, then some of those tools could be helpful to you. There are some uncertainties. There's no doubt in the coming year about sites that you will work with in your state, and we are aware of that. You can explain what those uncertainties are in your application. The peer reviewers will be aware of that, but do the best you can in thinking about who you want to work with and describing those places and how you would provide services. You may want to think about ramping up your professional development as you go. So not that this is required, but you could request a lower level of funding if you wanted to for that first year and then ramp up that next year. You've got to think about what makes the most sense for you and your state and how you'll be ready to get into early intervention programs or schools and districts. General requirements, you are required to make positive efforts to, employ and advance employment qualified individuals with disabilities. And giving a really, a nice description of that. The reviewers are looking to see that you have a meaningful description. And the next general requirement is about involving individuals with disabilities or parents of individuals with disabilities aged birth through 26 in planning, implementing, and evaluating the project. So these are your stakeholders. How will you have their voice as part of your work? We have created at OSEP some expectations for engaging families in discretionary grants. That is available at the signetwork.org homepage. There's a section for people who are, or states who are interested in applying. And I just took a few highlights out of it. This is not everything that is included in that document. A few highlights: provision of training, TA, and coaching to build the capacity of family members to participate fully in planning, implementing, and evaluating the project. So this is something to consider as you're writing your grant, what that might look like. Provision of training, TA, and coaching to build the capacity of all project staff to engage families equitably. Provision of financial resources such as honoraria and stipends for childcare and travel to support family members' active participation in the project planning, implementation, and evaluation, and recruitment of family members for positions on projects, including using non-traditional recruitment and networking strategies. So, as I said, we try to have someone from a parent training center, so one of the OSEP parent centers, on each of our panels, and they're going to look to see if there is meaningful family engagement that is part of your plan and what that's going to look like. So this is trying to give you some ideas for your plan. And then these are the assumptions that we base that work off of, that our discretionary grants will incorporate family perspectives and experiences into project operations that will benefit the project and its audiences, that to do true engagement, that you have to clearly plan how you'll engage families and build trusting and respectful partnerships and identify the expected outcomes of the collaboration. If you're not clear about where you want to get, and if you haven't worked with your partners that you're going to write in, it's unlikely you're going to get there. So having clear objectives, measurable objectives, and a description of what the work is going to look like together and the strengths that each partner brings to that collaboration. Effective engagement strategies that incorporate the most current research, capacity building strategies, adult learning principles and coaching. We talked about that, but that's important for family engagement as well. A continuum of support for families, especially now for the trauma-informed supports. That's something to be considering in culturally competent supports. And thinking about intensive ongoing work in building and maintaining the partnerships. We've heard from projects over time, it is not necessarily easy, it is worthwhile, but it takes some intensive work. And thinking towards how these partnerships can help you be more efficient and effective. To funding amounts. So we have an estimated $11,727,000 available, and the range of awards is from $500,000 to $2.1 million. I'm going to talk about that high level is not necessarily for everyone. That's about the population of your state. So if you are a large population state, that would be an estimated higher level for you. You can see Puerto Rico and District of Columbia included that in that. The outlying areas that are included here are the United States Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, and the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands. And it's a different range of awards there. And so the $80,000 is the base there. Other than the outlying areas, applicants must ask for $500,000 or more for each of the 5 years. We cannot go below $500,000. So when you're building out your budget, even if you're a small population state, do not go below 500,000. And even if you're if you're a small population state, what I talked about with starting a little smaller potentially and building up may not be as easy for you because of the rules that are governing this competition. So you have to start at 500,000. And I talked about the population. That's one thing that we take into account, the population of your state. It's a small population state, larger population state. And then we think about the activities that you're going to do and what makes the most sense to fund them, how critical they are to your state, how you've aligned with other activities in IDEA. And then thinking about the state plans that are being supported under ESSA or ESEA. Again, you should be thinking about what work is being supported at your SEA and how your work fits into it. That's all part of it. And then the use of research. So what's your evidence level for the work you do? The more evidence you have that it's going to be effective, the more likely that dollars supporting it are going to be well used. So the format and page limit recommendations, just make sure you take a good look at that. So this is 70 pages for the application narrative, 8.5 by 11, 1-inch margins, top, bottom, both sides, double space, all the areas, font that's 12 points or larger, and then Times Roman, Courier, etc. Appendices, this is in your application package. There are these directions. And so there's a suggested order. You've got to upload PDFs or Microsoft Word documents and thinking about that order for that. And then this is about the narrative attachment form and just talks a little bit about the fact that the table of contents and list of priority requirements do not count toward the recommended narrative page limit of 70 pages. Selection criteria, we have significance at 20 points, project design at 25, project personnel 10, resources and management plan 20, and evaluation 25. So you can see the higher level points are in the project design and in the evaluation. Significance, so I'm going to walk through somewhat quickly, but you can take a much better look at this after you've listened to the webinar. The extent to which a proposed project is part of a comprehensive effort to improve teaching and learning and support rigorous academic standards for students. So think about that comprehensiveness in your state. You identified gaps or weaknesses in services. So what are the needs in your state? Have you thought about the infrastructure that's there? This really has a nice connection to the state systemic improvement plan work you've done. What opportunities are there to help in this area of need? And also, the data should really describe how big is the need. So the professional development that you're doing, is it going to be high quality? Is it going to have enough intensity? Is it going to last for long enough to make improvements in practice? And what's the likelihood that everything you're doing is going to result in systemic change or system change or improvement? For project design, thinking about your goals, objectives, and outcomes and making sure they make sense, they're measurable, that the reviewer or anyone else could understand what you're trying to accomplish. And that's where we talked about the logic model, because that really helps you make some clear goals, objectives, and outcomes. Thinking about the needs of the target population. So it's being real specific about who you're trying to serve and why your work is going to help that target population. And then the collaboration of appropriate partners is so important for maximizing your effectiveness and having that real good idea of what your state plan is and alignment where appropriate. Up-to-date knowledge, we talked a bit about that, and linkages with appropriate agencies and organizations. So again, think, who are you trying to serve? Who's the population you're trying to serve? Who else serves them? Where can you connect? Where can you work together? Project personnel, so thinking about employing people from members of groups that have traditionally been underrepresented based on race, color, national origin, gender, age, or disability. And then thinking about the qualifications, including training experience, of your project director and of other key project personnel. How are you going to describe that? Continuing on, the adequacy of resources and quality of the management plan. So how will the reader know of the demonstrated commitment of each partner and how they're relevant to your work? And describing that the budget is adequate to support the work. And also your management plan. How are you going to achieve the objectives on time and within budget? Do you have clearly defined responsibilities? Do you have timelines that make sense? And do you have milestones to know if you're getting there? This is the management plan continued. And this is about the diversity of perspectives. We talked a little bit about it in OSEP expectations related to family engagement. And we also talked about the requirement of having an individual with a disability or a parent of an individual with a disability bringing their perspective. So this goes beyond that, thinking about teachers, other personnel, thinking about the business community, thinking about other professional fields, recipients and beneficiaries of your services. And then how will you sustain the work? The reviewers always look for that. What's your sustainability plan? It should be built into your application. Project evaluation, this is about how you go about your evaluation. And again, the goals, objectives, and outcomes should be clear. And then you should have methods that will help you to assess that. Formative methods of evaluation that will let you know about how your implementation strategies are doing. And good objective performance measures that will help you know if you're getting to the intended outcomes. And how would others be able to replicate? So how others in your state or perhaps beyond your state be able to replicate or test what you're doing? So having a real good understanding of this is what needs to be done. And we talk about in professional development, having a sequence of training or some kind of understanding of this needs to occur so personnel have the knowledge and skills and ability. And then feedback from your evaluation, will you be able to provide feedback to the personnel and to the leadership, the implementation teams? And what's acceptable implementation? What will be your benchmarks? So that is it for today. As I receive questions over time, I may also record another informational webinar and put it up. Our plan is always to have that up on the website where you find the notices, as well as on SIG Network. And then also we do try to notify people by email as well. But you're welcome once you have listened to the webinar, once you've looked over all the documents, the notices, as well as the application package overall, so those directions. Please let me know if you have any questions. I am available to you. And thank you so much for listening and for your time today.